Okay, so first of all, thank you for the invitation to the UT student chapter. It's a really pleasure to be here. I've seen some of the videos from previous professors, and it's great to have the opportunity to share some of my research with you today. Today we'll be talking about public transport accessibility, level of service, public transportation, and equity. And that I know that Stephen Farrer was talking about some of this last week. And I will be presenting a multi-source geospatial approach because basically this research uses a bunch of different data sources to measure accessibility and to have some sort of equity analysis. So before jumping into the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about me. I'm Ignacio. I'm a postdoc at the Department of Human Geography at the University of Toronto Scarborough. You have there my contact, my social media website if you want to contact me after. Basically my background is transportation engineering. I did all my education back in Chile, both my undergrad and also my PhD. I did a very short visit for a year at the University of Leeds. And then after that I started working as a postdoc in Chile in a Center for Urban Sustainable Development. And I arrived here in Toronto in 2021, so I've been here for 2.5 years basically, working in 2 different projects that I will be briefly presenting on this next slide. So basically my interests can be summarized as the impacts of transportation and land use patterns on daily lives, basically accessibility levels, sustainability outcomes, and particularly social equity. And when I arrived in Toronto, basically I was involved in a project called Suburban Mobilities. It was a multidisciplinary program at UTSC, combining basically expertise from 9 different disciplines with different departments. And our main goal was to tackle and to study more suburban inequalities. Our project was mainly based in the Scarborough in Toronto, and also the transportation impacts on climate change. And then after a while, I started working in another project. This year I joined the Mobilizing Justice project. And as I was saying, Steve was presenting last week about that. This is more like a partnership in Canada, so it's like a bigger project basically. The scope is not just a Scarborough or suburban context, more like Canada and different contexts across Canada. And the main idea is to tackle transportation problems, transportation poverty problems in Canada, and try to mobilize those findings and transform that into action in practice. So after this very brief introduction, this will be the outline of my presentation today. I will be presenting some sort of motivation of the research that I will be showing today. Then some research gaps that originated this paper in particular, the methodological approach, methods and data used for computing these public transport accessibility measures, the main findings, and then I want to basically link that research paper with ongoing and future research that we are doing right now in Toronto. So let's start with the motivation. When I started my PhD, I was particularly interested in the concept of accessibility, access to opportunities. And this concept can be classified or characterized by 4 different dimensions. The first one is basically characterizing by what you want to access opportunities. Different transportation modes, could be just one or a combination or more than one transportation mode. When are you analyzing that specific access to opportunities? It's more like peak hour, off-peak hours, or during a certain time frame. To what specific destination? Maybe you have a set of different destinations, or you're interested just in one particular destination that could be mandatory, schools, jobs, or more leisure, health, or other kind of activities. And finally, from where you're analyzing that access to opportunities. It's a location, but also who is living in that location. So different population groups with different needs and different capabilities. So scholarly research promotes accessibility as probably the main aim of transportation planning, assuming that it's a very good approach when we are trying to analyze how mobility contributes to well-being, individual well-being, and also participation in social life, basically participation in different activities. So accessibility can be very crucial when we are analyzing, for example, social and spatial inequalities and characterize settings across the world. The thing is, when we are talking about accessibility and specifically this application to equity, there's no, first of all, like no consensus on how it should be measured. You can see in the literature like a bunch of different measures to approach this problem. Some of them like very simple, just to basically leverage how we can translate that into practice. In other cases, more complex measures, but that could be like very different in how we consider, for example, those 4 dimensions that I mentioned before. Basically, how detailed is the transportation modes or the population groups that we are measuring, the different type of activities, and also the time that we are analyzing. So a couple of things to highlight here is in the literature, some authors have been proposing to incorporate into these accessibility measures users' perception, so not just like the objective time, and also personal characteristics and local context, basically how people experience those transportation systems and how that can be translated into metrics of accessibility. So early on my PhD, basically I engaged with this literature on accessibility and equity, with a particular focus on Latin America because I was studying there, given my Chile background. And with some colleagues, we did a literature review, basically trying to summarize the main findings or gaps at that point in terms of access and equity in the region. So we found like works in 31 cities, 3 regions, 8 countries, most of them belonging to South America. And we found great progress, especially in the last 10 years, but still like important gaps in terms of measures, the modes considered for those studies, the opportunities considered as well, like a strong focus, for example, on mandatory activities, personal differences as well, how they are being considered in different metrics, and different case studies as well. So I was particularly interested in contributing in Santiago, that is the place where I was raised and I study as well. And just for you to have an idea, Santiago is the capital of Chile. You can see here basically the transportation network. On red you have the metro lines, so we have good coverage in terms of like subway network. We have also a very good coverage in terms of buses, so we are covering most of the city with different levels of service, of course. And the thing is, in this area that you are seeing like darker here, is where most high-income households concentrate. And as you can expect, most of the activities like services, job opportunities, schools, and also transportation infrastructure is concentrated in that specific area. So with that in mind, basically this interest in accessibility, equity, and particularly in the case of Santiago, we try to approach different research gaps identified in that literature review. So the first research gap is public transport level of service. We were particularly interested in analyzing public transport accessibility. So when we are analyzing public transport accessibility, we need to consider access to the bus stop, subway station, the time that we are waiting for the vehicle or the train, the conditions, like in vehicle time basically, and the conditions while we are traveling, and then the final part that is basically reaching the final destination with like the rest time. Now I want to show you a couple of cases. Basically here both cases have a total travel time of 64 minutes. But you can see here some important differences in terms of level of service. In the case 1, you have first of all more walking time, more waiting time, a little bit less of in-vehicle time, but the conditions while traveling are worse in terms of comfort. So you have like more passengers per square meter, so basically you are crowded in that specific vehicle or train. And to arrive to your final destination, in the case 1, you also need to make a transfer. So basically you need to combine, for example, bus and subway. So even when these two cases basically have the same total travel time, we know that basically the experience might be very different for those cases. And traditional indicators of accessibility usually consider this total travel time without any different valuation of these attributes. So coming back to this call of some researchers of including using perception, we try to take that as like a motivation to do something about it, but the main thing is how to incorporate that experience or valuation of level of service into accessibility metrics. And we'll be talking more about that in the coming slides. So just for you to have an example, this is the subway and bus system in Santiago, so basically you can have like very different experiences. In some cases, very crowded, waiting for some vehicle to arrive. In other cases, you can be seated without any problem, so basically you have like a very comfortable trip to your final destination. This is particularly important when we are looking at like the equity side of things, because as most contexts worldwide, public transport use is relatively high. 26% of trips in Santiago are made by public transport. More than half are made by bus only. And we have some differences in terms of income and mode share. I know that that figure is in Spanish, so basically that's like a report in Santiago trying to show some differences in terms of mode share by different income. And you can see that in the case of lower income people, they use twice as much public transport than high income people. So basically it's also a matter of how we improve level of service, especially for lower income population. And the research gap too that we wanted to tackle in this particular research was trying to characterize better the quality of the different opportunities that people is accessing, and also how they compete for opportunities that have some capacity constraints. So when we are trying to characterize this, basically we have like the supply side, it's basically the amount, quality, and spatial distribution of opportunities, but also the demand for those opportunities. People that is living in a certain place and want to access a certain service. And competition for activities can be a problem for certain specific destinations. For example, just think about like a huge park, like Hyde Park, for example. Maybe you don't have like a restriction on how many people can be at the same time there. But in some other cases, for example, when you are looking at job opportunities or school vacancies or even hospital beds or specialists, it's something important. I mean, like the supply is not infinite, so basically you want to have some sort of measure on how many people want to access those opportunities and the supply that is offered. This is another like basically example and motivation in the case of Santiago. So this map basically shows access to education establishments in Santiago. In the green color, you can see areas that have like at least one establishment within 1 kilometer. So if you are looking at this, basically you said, oh, this is pretty good. Basically, most people have like access to schools like in the city. We don't have like any areas that are like underserved. The thing is, those opportunities are very different in terms of quality. And on the map that you're seeing on the right-hand side, that's a map that is showing the scores that people is getting in the test to enter the university system in Chile. And basically you can see again this cluster here in sky blue that are like scores that are beyond or higher than the average. And in the other cases you have like mixed cases and below the average. So the scores basically of different establishments are very clustered in the city. So even when you have some sort of like general good access to different opportunities, the quality of those opportunities and the quality of the education offered is very different in the city. And the problem with that, basically having this like very heterogeneous distribution of education opportunities in Chile, is that nearly 400,000 people, students, are traveling to other specific zones in the city because they are trying to reach better educational opportunities. And most of those trips, in the case of the students of like medium income and low income, are done by public transportation. So basically, we have a problem there on how we are serving those groups to arrive to those destinations in a reasonable amount of time, but also with a proper level of service. So based on those research gaps and motivation, I will now show our methodological approach, how we incorporate those elements into accessibility metrics. So if you remember this diagram that I showed at the beginning, basically we'll be analyzing public transport as the main transportation mode. We'll be using peak hour because it's usually the time where like students are arriving to school. We'll be looking at particularly high quality education, and I will be talking more about that, like how we determine high quality education in the context of Santiago. And we will be using public transport zones, like the authority basically divides the city in like 800 zones. So basically we characterize how good was accessibility for those different zones. But particularly we would be interested in looking at the demand, basically the public, the primary school students that are distributed in the city. So if you remember this slide from like a while ago, from this research gap, basically the main question was how to incorporate like the user evaluation of different elements into the final accessibility measure. And we started by a very traditional approach. So basically just adding total travel time. So we have like walking times, waiting times, and in-vehicle times. But then we try to incorporate this perception that I was talking about. Basically, we use the concept of total generalized travel time. And basically, for each element, we included a multiplier or a penalty based on the different components of this total generalized travel time. So let me try to explain better. Basically, we have studies from the 60s that have been trying to determine the value of time. And you have like monetary evaluations, but also in-vehicle time evaluations, basically trying to do some sort of like equivalency between walking times, waiting times, crowding conditions, or even like transfers into a measure, like a common measure of in-vehicle time. All these multipliers are based on extensive research in Santiago, so all these tables that you are seeing here, and basically the different multipliers, you have like 2 for walking time, 2 for waiting time, different multipliers depending on how crowded is the vehicle inside, like buses, for example, with 0 or 6 standing passengers per square meter, transfers as well. So this is all based on previous research in Santiago, so this is like context specific, and we were able to transform basically all these differences, different elements into just like one general measure of total generalized travel time, and to incorporate that into the accessibility measure. So after having these two like impedances, basically, we needed to compute the indicators. And we tried to compare two different approaches. The first one is like the typical one called potential approach, and the second one is this competition for opportunity, so the competitive approach. In the first one, basically you have like a very typical equation when you're just adding the number of opportunities you can access. In this case, for example, the sub k is basically the opportunities that you have in a certain place, and the time that you need to for reaching those opportunities. And that could be with the total travel time or the total generalized travel time. Now, when we are trying to incorporate basically competition, we need to be aware that some other people will be traveling from other places to those specific opportunities as well. Basically, they are competing for those opportunities. So basically, we're just adding this term of potential demand. So we have certain like a ratio, basically of total number of opportunities and the total number of opportunity seekers from other places. So as I showed in my previous slide, we will consider both total travel time and total generalized travel time. And now the question is how we obtain these different parameters into the equations, basically. So first of all, how we compute total travel time and total generalized travel time, how we characterize the different activities, and how we characterize the different demand that are like competing for those opportunities. So I will be trying to explain how we compute each of these elements in the coming slides. So this is an hypothetical scenario of like a public transport trip where like you leave home basically, arrive to your bus stop or subway station, you board your subway in this case, and then you are combining with a bus. So basically you have a transfer, you have a transfer time, a waiting time, then you have like some conditions of inside those vehicles, and you have some in-vehicle time, and finally you have the egress time to arrive to your final destination. How do we obtain estimations for each of these components? In the first part, basically when you just like board the first vehicle, basically you leave the system we use smart card data. And I mentioned here the GTFS data just because, and just to point it out something that in some context, when you are looking at GTFS data, it's basically operational data. You don't have like the same results as analyzing smart card data. So basically the operational, like the plan, operational plan is not the same as what is really occurring like in practice. You have like a big gap in terms of regularity of services, waiting times, crowding conditions that are usually not considered in this GTFS data. So we wanted to explore basically how we can use smart card data to have information about the origin and destination, number of transfers and time for transfers, and also travel times per trip leg. In this case, 2 trip legs in this hypothetical scenario. Then for walking times, we use Open Trip Planner. So basically we compute walking times to public transport stops and final destinations, so both for access and egressing from the system. We had a very disaggregated approach using cells of grids. And then we aggregated these results to the transportation zones that I mentioned before from the authority, just to provide like results that were useful for them in practice. Then for the waiting time in the first leg, because basically with the smart card data, we just know who is stopping in the first leg, but we don't know what happened before. So basically we don't know how many times people wait for the first service. And we use for that train and bus headways. I will be explaining more in the coming slide. And for crowding, we compute load profiles for buses and station-to-station flows in the case of subway. I will be explaining also more about how we compute that in the coming slide. So for the waiting times, we use a very well-known formula that basically considers half of the average headway for each service. If we just consider this part of the equation, basically, we are considering that basically all vehicles are regular, like are perfectly regular, and we know that basically that's not the case in most public transport systems worldwide. So we add the coefficient of variation into the equation just to introduce the effect of standard deviation of headways into our estimation of waiting times. One thing that is important to highlight, and I put it here as an assumption, is we are assuming that passengers are basically boarding the first vehicle that is arriving to the stop. That's not a huge limitation for the Santiago context, because especially in the peak hour, people is like willing to travel in like very, very special conditions. Like even when it's the vehicle or the subway train is like very, very crowded and packed, people manage to enter anyway because they need to arrive on time for jobs or school. So basically we don't have a lot of like denied boardings in the Santiago context, at least in the peak hour. For crowding conditions, we compute load profiles for each bus route. For that, we had the smart card validations previously, and we combined that with GPS data. So basically, we knew like the buses that were running and basically the amount of people like boarding and aligning from the bus. We correct those estimations by fare elevation. That is a huge, huge problem in Santiago. So overall, the system has like around 30% of fare elevation. That is one of the highest like in the world. And we try to correct by average fare elevation from these different zones in the city. So not in all parts like the fare elevation is 30%. In some cases, it's even like 40. In other cases, around like 15 or 20%. And then for each vehicle model that is running in each service, we have the number of seats and the standing surface inside the vehicle, so we're able to compute a measure of standing passengers per square meter for each passport. And for the subway system, we have like a kind of different approach because the company that is running the subway system had this estimation of passenger flows between two stations, aggregated every 15 minutes. And also they have the number of trains that were running during those 15 minutes. So we were able to compute an average passenger load per train. And we also had the information of the number of seats and also the standing surface. So basically we had this estimation of standing passengers per square meter, also for subway system. For the opportunities, we use a very, very interesting database from the Ministry of Education in Santiago. They provide a very disaggregated data on schools and basically the enrollment offer in each one. And also they provide information about quality, because for some of those establishments, they are subsidizing some of those establishments, like based on these different factors that I'm listing here. Effectiveness, overcoming, initiative improvement. We also have equal opportunities and integration participation. Basically, all these factors try to evaluate like student performance, continuous improvement of the school, educational innovations, working conditions, the presence of a community between teachers and parents, among other factors. So basically, it's a way to characterize those schools. And based on that, basically, we determine what will be our focus for this work. That it was schools that were free, because basically in Santiago we have a system that combines like different types of establishments, and we were particularly interested in how low-income population groups can access high-quality opportunities. So there was 317 establishments with almost 200,000 enrollments over the city. And finally, for the demand side, we estimate the number of students between 6 and 18 years old studying in municipal schools, combining both census data and also information from the ministry about the percentage of students per location studying in different types of establishments. So we were able to basically have an estimation on that for those particular establishments that we were analyzing. So what about findings? The first thing is we map this measure of total generalized travel time, converting, as you remember, waiting times, crowding conditions, and transfer into this in-vehicle time unit. So the map that I'm showing there basically shows that peripheral areas concentrate the worst level of service, meanwhile like more central areas have the better level of service. And to be honest, that's not like very surprising, probably something that you might expect, especially in a city like Santiago. In other cases might be different for the urban structure, but at least for Santiago, this is not surprising. So why is it important to include like basically this perception of the level of service? Well, the thing is, it deepens the inequity between zones. So basically in this map that I'm showing there, we have a ratio basically between the total generalized travel time and the total travel time. So we have some sort of measure of how good or bad is the level of service offered in that specific area. And we found ratios that can come from like up to 2.4 times more, concentrated especially, if you look here, basically in the red colors, in the south area of the city and the west area of the city. What does it mean basically to have like this 2.4 ratio in that map that I'm showing there? Basically, people is experiencing there on average like 1 to 2 transfers to arrive to the final destination. They usually experience between 4 to 5 passengers per square meter in their trip, and they have like a 15-minute waiting time during that morning peak, considering like all the trip legs, right? So after that, the question was, okay, let's try to compare if like really our approach, considering this level of service and competition for opportunities, is really different from like the traditional approach. So basically, we computed this potential-based measure that is based on supply of opportunities and total travel time. It's basically this one. And then we started to incorporate just like one factor into that specific proposal. So in the first case, we added total generalized travel time. So we keep the same measure, basically just considering supply, but now considering the perception of level of service. In this case, we only consider competition, but just like keeping total travel time. And in this case, that is our proposal basically, is considering both perception level of service, but also competition for urban opportunities. And you can see like important differences. Basically, here are like the percentual differences with like the first or the original proposal or the typical indicator. And you can see even differences like 40% or 20% like dispersed over the city. Maybe this map is not very clear comparing like the traditional approach versus our approach. So maybe this slide will clarify that. Rather than looking at all four measures, I will be comparing like the traditional accessibility approach versus our approach. So first of all, we compute this potential-based measure, considering the supply of opportunities and just total travel time. And you can see this very similar like pattern compared to one of the first map that I showed regarding like the total travel time. So basically more central areas with better access. Here basically in greener colors, and lower accessibility in the peripheries. Now, if we consider competition and also total generalized travel time, we have like a mixture of like results basically. It's not the same. Let's look at that particular area that I highlighted there. Basically, in this area that is like very central to the city, because like most of the like city center, the CBD is like concentrated in this area. In this case, like with the potential-based measure using total travel time, we have like a very good access to opportunities, basically in greener colors. Then you can see here that when you are adding competition and the perception of level of service, that is like a mixture of things. When you are looking at those like redder colors, means that you have like undersupply of educational opportunities, and when you are looking at like more greener colors, you have like an oversupply. So you have like a mixture, like that is like a bit different compared to the other map, and basically providing another perspective on how good is access to opportunities and how equitable is access to opportunities. Moreover, if we have to prioritize, let's say you have like a specific budget to improve accessibility, and you want to tackle basically the 10% lower scores using two different approaches, this one and that one. We will have a 30% discrepancy on the zones that will be intervening if we are using those different approaches. So when we are trying to think about like interventions, investments that can improve accessibility conditions, it really matters on how you measure and basically what is your interest in, like in terms of just exploring total travel time without any consideration of level of service, or just like considering the supply of opportunities without any competition. Focusing on our approach, I wanted to show you basically this inequitable scenario. So it's like a very uneven distribution. Around 20% of the zones in Santiago have at least 50% deficit of higher quality education. And the thing is that 20%, from those 10%, like 70% are in peripheral areas, okay, where most of the low-income people live. I will show you like some numbers on that in following slides. Moreover, if we are looking at oversupply, we have 12% of the zones in Santiago that have at least 25% of oversupply from education. And the thing is that from those 12%, 70% are located in more central or pericentral areas where most like a mixed income or high income people usually live. And here is like a better analysis on how different accessibility values are distributed among different income groups. So in each zone in Santiago, basically we classify each zone depending on the percentage of households that belong to the 40% lowest income, okay? So basically on that, we classify and have like 4 different categories, like high income, medium high, medium low, and low. And the thing is, the main result is that high income group has like 1.2 more accessibility to higher quality education than the lower income group. And the ratio between this deficit of opportunities and oversupply of opportunities is 40% lower in the higher income group in relation to the lower income group. So basically, for these like free high quality opportunities, we are not doing a very good job of offering those opportunities for the people who need them most. Now, the proposed indicators that I show, like in this presentation, are not considering basically any kind of special capabilities or differences between users. We are just characterizing like the accessibility, average accessibility for like an average user that we know that it doesn't exist. So basically, simultaneously to this work, we were working on another approach, trying to understand accessibility from like a mixed methods approach. There's like a paper published on that, basically how we managed to combine more like quantitative methods and qualitative methods. And what we found in the focus group we made is that people is experiencing a bunch of different mobility barriers. That could be like problems with like time space, basically how you spend your time, capabilities, basically how like capable you feel to use different transportation modes, if you feel confident to use them, how you perceive the public space and the transport environment, if it's safe, not safe, is convenient, not convenient, beautiful or not, the context, basically where you live, economic barriers, like basically how much of like a burden is basically paying a public transport fare or just like running your car, the relationship with technology, gender also barriers that are like very important in terms of like culture or like safety perception. So basically we have differences in terms of how people can perceive the transportation system and the level of service. And in that work we try to incorporate that. So we found a couple of other works in Santiago trying to measure these differences. So we have two studies, one that is trying to say how different is perceived like walking times for men and women. And the differences mainly rely that women usually goes like with more bags, for example, or strollers or kids. So basically the perception of waiting time, the walking time is higher. And in the case of the second study, they propose a latent class choice model trying to characterize two different classes based on gender, income, and age. And basically, we use those outputs of the latent class choice model to compute probabilities to belong to different classes based on those characteristics, gender, age, and income, and therefore changing, basically, the crowding multipliers that I showed in the beginning for others that are like more aligned with different profiles. So just to show you one comparison that I think that is very illustrative on how important it is to consider those differences. Here I'm showing one case of a man, 30 years old, high income, based on the specific latent class choice model, and another kind of profile, a woman, 50 years old, low income. And the thing is, we can see a gap, an important gap of 44 additional perceived in vehicle minutes. And the thing is, when we are doing this like gender neutral or like average user assessment, we are on average underestimating by 11% the accessibility of this group. And we are overestimating basically the other group, a woman, 50 years old, low income, by 18%. So we have some differences there, and the main message is, if you can consider like in any way the type of differences in terms of perception for different user profiles, try to do it. Like, of course, we are having like some important gaps in terms of how we measure. So just wrapping up this part of the presentation, this work contributes to the literature by three different paths. The first one is incorporating the user subjective evaluation of attributes that impact the real service, and we try to compare that with traditional indicators. We use disaggregate stop-to-stop data with the smart card data instead of the GTFS information that usually considered not very realistic public transport operation, at least in the Santiago context and usually in Latin American context as well. And we account for competition for activity destination considering quality. That is very important, especially when we compare those results with traditional and simple potential measures. Some lessons and final considerations. We found that competition has a stronger impact than subjective evaluation of the level of service when incorporating into accessibility measures. So I know this is like very particular. It's a case study in Santiago for a specific type of activity. But basically our recommendation is try to go for competitive measures if you can, because the result will be very different. Another thing to point it out as a limitation, I would say, for how transferable are these results or methodology to other contexts is this is a very data-intensive approach. Basically, you saw that basically we use multiple data sources. So in some cases of the operation of public transport, in some cases of like the location of the different opportunities, the quality of those opportunities, where people usually live. So especially that pose like challenges for the global south, and in some cases, case studies that is really, really difficult basically to gather that information to have some sort of approach like this. This approach, I think that provides a more like a comprehensive way to understand accessibility and provide also hints on where and how to intervene to improve equity with like a focus on urban equity. And another thing that is important, like outside basically the domain of transportation, is how we ensure that these considerations of level of service or competition are considered when we are planning for social housing. In Chile, there's like an approach that is basically, let's try to construct new social housing in places where you can find like high levels of accessibility. And the approach of high levels of accessibility is just like saying, hey, you are like in a proximity of a bus stop or in a proximity of a subway station. But you are not considering like the services that are running in that specific stop, the amount of people that want to use those specific opportunities, and the opportunities that people want to reach. So basically, we need to like take a more comprehensive approach when we are trying to really provide and improve basically the conditions and opportunities that people living in those social housing projects will have in the future with those specific investments. If you want to know more details about the work that I just presented, there's also a paper published on this. So basically more details about it, like more figures, more findings. I just tried to summarize the main things that I thought it could be interesting for this presentation. Finally, ongoing and future research. I just want to point it out like this, one of the first slides that I show in this presentation about this no consensus on how it should be measured, accessibility, and the importance of considering like user perception and personal characteristics. And now in Toronto, we are particularly interested in how perceptions of accessibility have a role, preferences for different type of amenities or investments, and also the outcome of those like perceived accessibility measures or preferences in the neighborhood. And I think that's really important, especially when we are looking at suburban context. So basically, we did an exploration in Scarborough in this project that I mentioned at the beginning with the suburban mobilities cluster. We did a survey in Scarborough trying to explore different areas related to accessibility, preferences, and neighborhood satisfaction. We are in a project right now with the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation trying to explore the concept of complete communities. So we did like an analysis of that survey and also doing some focus groups. Here's a team that is working on that project. So most of the things that I'll be showing here is like a joint work between students, postdoctoral fellows, and also some professors. So first of all, what we understand by complete communities, I know that maybe you have heard about this concept or like the concept of 15-minute city that was like very popular, especially during and after the pandemic. So basically this idea of providing different neighborhoods convenient access to goods, services needed in daily life. So this is very, very related with the concept of proximity or 15-minute city. But the thing is, we don't have like a very clear idea on what makes a neighborhood complete from the resident's point of view. We usually think, okay, just like providing more access to opportunities will make this neighborhood complete. But of course, there are like other factors that plays a role here as well. So basically, we try again to explore perception, preferences, and outcomes. And I will be showing some of the things that we have been exploring. First of all, neighborhood preferences. So in the survey, we include one thing that is asking respondents to rank amenities in terms of preferences. What you want to have in your neighborhood, what you want to have like in your community. If you want to rank this, you have like different categories basically here. Schools, childcare facilities, restaurants, cultural facilities, like a bunch of different type of opportunities. Now, we have on one side what you want to have in your neighborhood, and the other thing is what you really have in your neighborhood. So the first thing we did, it was computing this 15-minute access to different destinations in a SCAR. Now, what to do with that specific measure? Well, we tried to set up like some kind of normative sufficient access. What is a sufficient access? Basically, we don't want to have like access to 30 restaurants or bars. Maybe just with one is enough for you to say, hey, I have available like a place where I can go to have a drink, or just to buy something, or I have a school or a service that is like enough basically to fulfill like my needs in terms of a specific destination. So basically we set like different standards in here, and we said, okay, this place has sufficient access for this particular opportunity and doesn't have access for this particular opportunity based on those different standards. And now we try to compare basically how it looks when we are comparing sufficient access versus preferences. And the thing is that we don't have like a clear picture here. So you can see here basically three groups. These are like the most preferred destinations that you want to have in your neighborhood. And you can see that here, usually like around 70% of people really have sufficient access to that. In some other cases, you have like the least preferred options, like other services, childcare facilities, or places of worship, that has like the highest percent of sufficient access. So basically some sort of mismatch there. You have higher access to something that is not really important to you. And here in the middle, you have like a very important variability, and even like for some specific opportunities, you might rank this like very high, for example, 6, 7, like in these cases like financial institutions or schools, that only 30% of the residents really have access to that. So we have some sort of problem in terms of mismatch between preferences and what you really have in your neighborhood. We compute from that completeness scores. So what is a complete score? Basically using the ranking. If you remember, there were like 12 different amenities. So if you rank one as like the top priority, we will put that as like 12. And for the lowest ranking, we provide 1. And we will be evaluating if you have sufficient access to that or not. And for that, we compute a completeness score. It's basically just like the multiplying those two terms. If you have sufficient access to something that is very important to you, it will add a lot to your specific indicator. If you don't have access to that, it's not adding anything. And of course, if you have access to things that are not really important to you, this is not like contributing a lot to the indicator. What we did with that specific completeness score, try to see if that completeness score has some sort of relationship with perceived accessibility. And we have one particular question in that survey that it was, how you perceive that, how easy is to reach the services you need on a daily basis. Basically, you provide like a scale from 1 to 5. For this particular case that it was just an exploration, we grouped them like in yes or no. So we have a logistic regression model. And we found factors that are contributing to that higher perceived accessibility and elements that are contributing to lower that perceived accessibility. And to increase that perceived accessibility, we have completeness scores. So if you have like a higher completeness score, basically not a mismatch between what you want and what you really have, that is contributing on how you perceive like your accessibility in daily life. Car access, of course, if you have a car, probably you have like a perception that you can arrive to any place. If you have higher income and higher age, of course also you have probably more resources available. And one thing that it was kind of surprising for us, it was if you are a visible minority, usually you have a subjective, a perceived accessibility that is higher. And really looking and going deep into the Scarborough dynamics, we found out that basically visible minorities usually concentrate in places that are like condos, that are like in very major roads that you have like a lot of opportunities available. So maybe you have a problem more on the housing side that is like affecting your perception of completeness or how satisfied are you with your neighborhood, but at least you have access to certain opportunities that are key for you in your daily life. And as expected, of course, we have perceptions of road safety and personal safety decreasing that perceived accessibility. So if you don't feel safe, like crossing a street or like walking at night or like boarding certain transportation services, you will have a problem. So next steps, incorporating housing diversity and affordability in these measures of completeness and how complete are neighborhoods, and exploring other factors that might be related to perceived accessibility and neighborhood satisfaction. That's all. Happy to take any questions, and thanks for the attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I have like a two-part question on the topic of schools and the accessibility to education opportunities in Santiago. So part one is just informational. Like here in Canada, from what I understand, you kind of have to go to the public school that's in your area. And where I'm from, you can go to whatever public school you want to. So where does Chile lie on that spectrum? Is it closer to the Canada case or the Kenya case? Part two is, from what I understand, because here in Canada you have to go to the school nearest where you live, the school access, the educational inequality issue becomes a housing inequality issue because now the quality of schools gets capitalized with the housing price. So the housing prices near good schools end up being much higher. In Kenya, that's not as much of an issue because you can just go to whatever school you want to.
Right.
But there is still a bit of that because it's uncomfortable to have a 2-hour journey to school. So, like, how much of the school inequality issue in Santiago becomes a housing price issue, and how much becomes a transportation issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, like in Santiago, it's like the Kenya case. Basically, people can go to any school they want. And if you remember one of the slides that I showed, it was like this. Let me see if I can share that. This one. So basically, this is like a way to map. It was like a work done by other researchers looking at how people travel to educational opportunities over the city. So nearly 400,000 students are moving to another place to find like high quality educational opportunities. So it's a matter of distribution of those opportunities. So as I mentioned, like there's a role on how we place high quality educational opportunities in the city. But now in the current like situation, it's a transportation problem because we need to provide like convenient access to those opportunities given that this is our situation. So as you were saying, this is not like a really housing problem, at least in the case of Santiago. What happened though is in this area that I mentioned before, that is where like higher income groups concentrate, you have higher prices of housing, but people there is accessing another type of education because we have the public education that is subsidized and is the focus of this analysis, but we also have private education that is like high quality, and basically people is not caring about if you have like a public school that is very good because I'm sending my kids to that private school. So there's some sort of relationship in that in terms of like quality and housing prices, but especially for like higher income people that can choose between those two types of education.